meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Transport and Communication to order. Today we're meeting under our general order of reference to study the deductibility of foreign internet advertising. I'd like to welcome the representatives of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, Mr. Daniel Bernard, Executive Director, spokesperson, Ian Morrison, spokesperson, and Peter Miller, consultant and author of the report, Close the Loophole, the Deductibility of Foreign Internet Advertising. Thank you, and I invite you to make your opening remarks, and afterwards, senators will have a number of questions, I'm sure. So, who's starting? Mr. Bernard? Okay, please.
Honourable Senators, thank you for inviting us to appear today. My name is Daniel Bernhard. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, as Senator Tkachuk just mentioned. With me today are Ian Morrison, the founder of our movement, and Peter Miller, the co-author of the Close the Loophole report released April 24th, which should be available to all of you now. Strong journalism secures our democracy, and Canadian storytelling asserts our culture and independence. Both are in mortal danger as the advertising revenue which once sustained them is diverted to American tech monopolists with great help from Canadian tax policy. Friends of Canadian Broadcasting is a watchdog group for Canadian content on air and online. We enjoy the support of 364,000 Canadians whose after-tax gifts finance our work. We are not affiliated with any broadcaster or political party. Les médias canadiens sont
Canadian media are in free fall. On May 8th, La Presse announced that it could not survive without subsidies and donations. La Presse is Quebec's largest daily, serving an addressable market of nearly 7 million people. Its threatened demise after 134 years is the latest in a steady stream of media closures across Canada.
Of the internet advertising crisis facing Canadian media. In 2017, Canadian advertisers spent an estimated $6.2 billion on digital ads, and 80% of that, $5 billion, flows to foreign media companies, principally Google, its subsidiary YouTube, and Facebook. Google's Canadian revenue now exceeds that of all Canadian over-the-air television stations combined. Meanwhile, Canadian newspapers, both in print and digital formats, have seen advertising revenues decline by more than 50% since 2006. Our research projects that as many as 50% of television stations in small and medium Canadian markets could also close by 2021. News Media Canada estimates that Canada has lost 16,000 journalism jobs over the past decade. What many Canadians do not yet know is that our government contributes to this emergency by failing to apply long-standing tax law to ads placed with foreign internet media companies, including Google and Facebook. For 5 decades, ads placed with foreign media have not been tax deductible under the Income Tax Act. Section 19 provides a material incentive for advertisers to work with Canadian outlets whose journalism secures our democracy and whose storytelling nourishes our culture. Yet the Government of Canada does not apply these provisions to internet-delivered media. A Canadian company advertising in the Canadian edition of the New York Times cannot deduct the cost of that ad. But if the exact same ad is placed on nytimes.com, advertisers can claim the full deduction. The net effect of this is to make advertising products sold by Google, Facebook, and other foreign digital media companies 26% cheaper. And as a result, Canadian governments are foregoing $1.3 billion in tax revenue each year. We've been working on this file for some 24 months, and since then the principal beneficiaries of this subsidy have been in the news for the democracy-eroding consequences of their business model worldwide.
Exempting foreign tech companies from Section 19 is crushing Canadian media. La Presse is the most recent example, but hundreds more papers and TV stations are near or past the point of no return. These outlets brought news and entertainment to communities such as Brandon, Kenora, and Guelph that now go without. Meanwhile, TV stations are hanging on by their fingernails in places like Thunder Bay, Kamloops, and Rivière-du-Loup.
Canadian media is not inevitable. The government can close the loophole that subsidizes our media's main competition. The government should act now before even more Canadian journalism and storytelling fade to black. The $10 million annual community journalism fund proposed in the 2018 federal budget is merely a token gesture that addresses neither the symptoms nor the cause of this crisis facing our media. Large outlets such as the Globe and Mail may survive in this new environment, but their focus is not local. Who will cover city council deliberations, MP and MLA announcements, the courthouse, or local events, sports, and crime? Who will report on harassment scandals in Newfoundland or data breaches in Nova Scotia? Who will report on contentious electoral reforms on PEI or keep citizens up to date with flooding in New Brunswick? Who will report on the state of mental health services in Manitoba? Who will establish a bureau in Regina or Lethbridge or Kelowna? Well, Google and Facebook most definitely won't. They may be the main beneficiaries of this advertising shift, but they don't employ a single journalist in Canada. And in fact, one of the main reasons why Google and Facebook are so profitable is that they don't have to pay for the content they surround with ads. Much of that content comes from credible news organizations who pay journalists, but are no longer able to benefit from the ad revenue that this journalism generates. If we don't act now, there may be no one left to tell our stories, no one left to hold governments accountable or promote Canadian culture on air or online. And even if the likes of Facebook and Google were saintly, the need for action would be no less pressing. Someone might view this crisis as the market rejecting an inferior product, but readership and confidence remain strong. News Media Canada reports that 88% of Canadian adults read the news in a given week in a variety of formats. A 2017 Nanos research poll that we commissioned found that 84% of Canadians trust Canadian radio news, 83% trust newspapers, and 80% trust broadcast television. Only 17% trust Facebook. Readership is not the problem. The digital shift hits home because it increases the likelihood that a gatekeeper, such as Facebook, will take a lion's share of the advertising revenue while creating no content whatsoever. Senators, our proposal is very, very simple. Apply Section 19 of the Income Tax Act to internet advertising. If Canadian businesses cannot deduct the cost of ads in the New York Times, why should nytimes.com be treated differently? We urge you to use your power of recommendation to call on the government to act. Our report projects, conservatively, that closing the internet advertising loophole would repatriate up to $440 million of ad spending per year, while boosting federal and provincial revenues by $1.3 billion. The report identifies 3 different ways to close this loophole. First, update the definition of broadcasting in the in the Income Tax Act to match that of the Broadcasting Act and the CRTC's pronouncements on internet-delivered broadcasting. Amend the Interpretation Act to replace its obsolete definition of broadcasting with the Broadcasting Act's technology-neutral definition, so that a single, consistent definition applies across the law. And finally, revise the advertising tax deductibility provisions of the Income Tax Act to apply equally to all foreign media, including internet-delivered media. We are not asking government to tell business where to advertise. This proposal would simply level the playing field by applying existing law to the digital domain. This is a market-based approach that avoids the danger of direct government subsidy for journalism that could be abused to reward friendly coverage and penalize dissent. Closing this loophole won't end Google and Facebook's dominance over public speech in Canada, at least not on its own. But it will support credible Canadian journalism, which is needed now more than ever before. It will also ensure that Canadians are no longer subsidizing Google, Facebook, and their democracy-eroding business models with billions of dollars in tax money. Canada can't survive without its own stories. Our democracy cannot survive without credible Canadian journalism. Thanks again for inviting us to appear today, and we welcome your questions.
I'll just start with a short question. Canadian business, they don't advertise to get a tax deduction. They advertise to sell product. So why do you think they're using Google rather than CFQC television in Saskatoon, for example, when both of them are geared to advertise to sell product, but it seems that business people are making a choice to go somewhere else because it is a level playing field. They're both are tax deductible.
I think there are a couple things. You're definitely correct that advertisers are looking for cost-effective reach, and the products that Google, Facebook, and other American internet companies are selling clearly do provide some value to advertisers. We are, in our report, projecting that closing this loophole will not end advertising with American internet companies. We're projecting that less than 10% of that money would be repatriated. But there is a broader public policy objective, which is that Canadian journalism and storytelling are absolutely fundamental to our democracy. In local news, for example, the decline of local news in many communities means that journalists are simply taking the mayor's press release and repeating it verbatim. And they have no ability to have someone at City Hall or at the courthouse. And as we know, a government that operates under those conditions can get away with all sorts of malfeasance and chicanery that's not welcome. So these provisions, which have been around for 50 years in Canadian law, which previously anticipated the full spectrum of available options in magazines, TV, and radio, are simply not being applied to this new option that's been added to the mix. And the public policy objective of ensuring that there is Canadian journalism and storytelling is, as a result, slipping through the cracks.
I kind of agree with you that there should be a level playing field. So, and I know you have a concern that government grants to the media would jeopardize their fair coverage of what's happening in the country. So do you think that, doesn't that apply to the CBC as well? I mean, the CBC gets a huge ton of money, $1.4, $1.5 billion from the federal government, and CTV and Global get nothing. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that same logic apply? Why aren't you asking that we get rid of the CBC so that we have a level playing field and no possibility that there would be political interference in the broadcasts, in news broadcast in Canada?
I think the CBC funding is of a different nature. I mean, Ian may want to comment on this, but it is a consistent allocation that's been around for many, many years. As you know, with many nonprofit organizations who apply for grants from government, but also from foundations, the funding cycle is typically much shorter, and there are no guarantees. So it's on again, off again. And the capricious nature of that relationship leads people to pander towards what they think their funders would look like, would like to see. On the CBC question, one of the reasons why the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting has long advocated for more independence for CBC governance is to reduce the probability of this type of pandering within public broadcasting. We believe that public broadcasting, however, because of its long tradition and the idea that this is an established institution that will continue to be funded and that is independently governed, becomes very, very different to companies seeking government handouts for how they report on the government. I think it's a very different function. I mean, do you have anything to add on that?
Mr. Chair, half of Canada and a part of Canada that you're very sensitive to is small and medium-sized communities. And the danger projected in the report that you're studying today is that in those communities, it may end up, if the trend continues, that no journalism will be available other than the CBC. And even supporters of public broadcasting, the 85% of Canadians who like it, they don't want it to have a monopoly on the news. So one of the things that would happen were you to look favorably on the application of Section 19 to foreign digital advertising would be to defend the the diversity of sources of journalism available to Canadians outside the big cities.
Okay, I'll go now to Senator Plett, and Senator Boisvenu, Mercer, Gagne, and Bovee. So Senator Plett.
Thank you, Chair. And the Chair did ask one of the questions I was going to ask, but I will continue on that a little bit. As you gentlemen all know, we did a fairly thorough study on CBC a year or two ago. I was on committee, as was Senator Dawson and Senator Mercer. I don't know if others, but we were on that when we did a thorough study, and you, of course, were witnesses at that time. You say that you want a more independent CBC. Well, a more independent CBC, as the chair says, would be not getting a subsidy, and then they could be independent. I think as long as they're getting $1.5 billion a year, they can't really say, well, we want independence, but we still want the money. That's a comment, not a question. My question is, and I'm a lowly plumber from Manitoba, and I'm not a tax lawyer or a tax accountant, but in page 2 of your presentation, you talk about the disparity in being able to deduct the cost of advertising and getting a tax deduction. And this is costing the Canadian government $1.3 billion in tax revenue. I want you to explain that to me. To me, you're saying if you advertise with the New York Times, you cannot deduct the cost of that ad. If you're deducting the cost of that ad, is the government not losing tax revenue then?
If you deduct the cost of the ad, the government does lose tax revenue. That's where the $1.3 billion is coming from. So the existing provisions say that if you advertise in a foreign newspaper, magazine, radio station, television station to try and reach a Canadian audience. So I'm from Toronto. Don't hold it against me. The example that's always been used are businesses that would advertise with a television station in Buffalo, for example, that broadcasts back into Canada. And they would do that because the television station in Buffalo has programming that's financed for the U.S. market, which is 10 times the size. So they had, Johnny Carson or The Simpsons or, whatever American program was desirable. And so they would broadcast back in, and it was relatively cheap for them to do that. And as a result, Canadian broadcasters who were doing news and journalism and storytelling in Canada were in decline. That's why these rules were brought in 50 years ago, to say the deductibility of those advertising expenses would be limited or removed entirely. So what's happening with the internet now is that we have not applied that same principle. The principle that's enshrined in the law now says if you advertise in the New York Times to come back into Canada, you can't deduct it. You can do it, but there's a bit of a speed bump there, which is meant to provide an incentive to Canadian media that levels the playing field a little bit based on the economies of scale. And we're just not applying that. So we are allowing these deductions that the spirit of our existing law says we shouldn't allow, and that's where the $1.3 billion comes from. That's how the government's foregoing revenue. So you're exactly right in your analysis.
Well, until yesterday, we could say one of the biggest differences between Winnipeg and Toronto was that Winnipeg was still playing hockey. we can't say that. Toronto applied for an NHL team. Again, would if we just simply took what are you advocating for? That we don't allow that we do allow the Canadians that advertise in the New York Times to deduct, or that advertise in NewYork.com not to deduct?
The latter.
The latter.
The latter.
But would the former not do exactly the same thing?
The former is
it would level the playing field either way.
It's already that deduction in the New York Times is already prevented. So it would. We have in our existing law the idea that these deductions for foreign media are not beneficial to Canada's public policy objectives, because the New York Times, if it took all of the advertising, for example, That might suit a business that advertises in that publication, but it doesn't suit the citizens of Manitoba or anywhere else who are relying on a local newspaper to report on what's happening at the legislature, for example. And so this public policy objective says that we should provide some incentive to make it a little bit relatively more affordable to advertise in these publications.
Just a brief comment and question, Chair. I really believe that the networks, in large part, and what you're saying is correct, but they are their own worst enemy. I mean, I'm from southeastern Manitoba. We have a newspaper in southeastern Manitoba called the Carillon. And now we have an organization there called Steinbeck Online, which basically does exactly what the Carillon does, except they do it online. And I go and read it online. That is the Carillon's biggest enemy. It's not any tax deductions, it's that. And the fact that because everybody's doing everything online, it's created a bit of a laziness in journalism. If you come and sit in our gallery this afternoon, you won't see any media across the way. They are sitting in their offices, and they are listening to us, and then they are reporting online as we go along. I read my news on National News Watch. I don't buy newspapers. And so I don't think by putting in more regulations we're going to fix any of these problems. It's the public that is accepting something, and the government shouldn't interfere. So just a brief comment on that. That really wasn't a question, but please give me your comment on that.
So we're not talking about additional regulation first. We're talking about applying existing regulation to all forms of media. And the second thing I would point out is that La Presse, in its recent last-ditch attempt to survive, La Presse was a world leader in having digital-only products. Readership has been at an all-time high across these publications, even in digital form. The issue is that they can't make the same money off the ads in digital form because there are these gatekeepers that are taking, these middlemen that are taking a huge part of the money. So respectfully, I think that we're talking about an equal playing field with existing regulation, and that the internet, the shift to digital is not the issue. It's the shift of the advertising money that we believe is the cause of this. Thank you.
Bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I have a comment. You want to tax something, but the government has decided not to tax Netflix, so I see a bit of a contradiction in this. I'm from Quebec, and I have followed the online format of La Presse, and I feel that they have not well served their readers. And in Quebec, we know that the media have a great deal of competition from the Americans. What you're saying today is that we have to apply more taxes, but one of the responsibilities, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is for these companies that have taken such a large role in the computerization, the online formats. 5 or 10% of companies a few years ago were involved in that. But I find it very troubling to think that we have to add taxes to protect companies that haven't worked in their own best interest. You say that La Presse needs subsidies, but we know that Power Corporation is the owner, and that's a huge company. So why should the federal government subsidize companies that are very wealthy because there are difficulties in specific cases? Again, corporations are saying that it is up to the federal government to help out when it should be up to the corporations themselves. We agree that direct subsidies for journalism is not ideal. So we are talking here about a structural solution that can help not just traditional media, but also new media, new participants in the digital market, various digital publications. And you have said correctly that direct subsidization is a bad idea. We are concerned by the situation at La Presse. I'll ask if Ian has something to add. Senator, if you consult our document here, we'll close the loophole, you will see that what has happened over the last 10 years with respect to revenues available for advertising in Canada, and you will see that, generally speaking, the advertising in publications like La Presse and the Globe and Mail and so on has fallen by half in comparison with what it was available in 2006, for example. And you can see here on this graph that the same is true for television and radio advertising. This is a huge change in the amount of advertising. It's a 1,000% change in online advertising. But if you tax Canadian companies that are advertising on the internet and other countries don't do the same, well, this would apply only to advertising for foreign internet advertising. So you're talking about a Canadian company that advertises online abroad. Yes, this would be for advertising targeting Canadian audiences. So if abroad those advertisers are not taxed, will there be a problem of competitiveness? I will explain this in my first language.
Equilibrium today,
Voilà.
because in 2017, 6.2 6,2 milliards de dollars.
$6.2 billion is spent on internet advertising, and $5 billion of that goes out of Canada. So $5 billion is missing from this Canadian advertising. It's being lost. So we feel that this change should be made so that the $5 billion should not be lost in this way. I just have one last question, Mr. Chairman. How can we have a policy that is reasonable if the government is going to be taxing advertising outside Canada but isn't taxing Netflix activities here in Canada? We have rules. There is a government system. And now the government has chosen to allow certain foreign companies to be exempted from our regulations and rules. So we want a level playing field. There are other examples, as you have mentioned, Netflix, that are operating outside this system and that could be regulated like all other companies.
Beauvais, Galvez, Dawson. Senator Mercer.
Well, thank you, Chair, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. As I was reading your presentation, I made a note here that Canadians would be shocked that government's passing up the opportunity to collect $1.3 billion in tax revenue every year as they file their income tax. I'm sure they didn't realize that the government was missing out on this opportunity. However, I think one of the problems here is we need to simplify the answer. We need to say, what do we have to do? Do we have to amend the legislation, or do we just have to enforce the legislation is in place? I see a letter in here that was written by the CRA denying this. I'm a little shocked that they've come up with this interpretation. Because to me, if it's advertising, it's advertising, whether it's done digitally or whether it's done the old-fashioned way. But my main point is there not a simple, I don't want to complicate this beyond what needs to be, a simple method for the government to change how tax deductions are allowed as the technology changes? Because what we're seeing today is not what we'll see in 5 years. Everything is moving so fast, and so if we make a change to fix this today, we'll be back here in 5 years if we don't put in some method for the government, with some oversight provided in some form, to fix this. Is there a way for government to fix this and allow it to be fixed in the future as the technology changes and as the market changes? Is there a way for us to do that?
I'll ask my colleague Peter to comment on some of the specifics, but in terms of your general proposition that simple framing would be helpful, I'd like to try and provide one. We are only asking for existing law to be applied to any and all advertising, irrespective of the medium of delivery. So it's not just the internet, it's the principle that foreign advertising should be treated the same in our law, no matter the method of delivery. Peter can speak, however, to a couple of the specific actions that can be taken to further this objective.
Mr. Miller?
Thank you, Senator. As Daniel said in his opening remarks and as we lay out in the paper, there's three approaches that we saw for accomplishing this. The first two relate to essentially the definition of broadcasting and using the technologically neutral approach that the Broadcasting Act of 1991 has and the way the CRTC interpreted it. And to your earlier point, as authors of the study, we were very surprised to learn that CRA was relying on a 1968 definition in the Interpretation Act rather than the up-to-date, I say that almost jokingly, up-to-date 1991 Broadcasting Act definition that nevertheless was technologically neutral and has stood the test of time. That said, that approach, while it's superficially easy, leaves vast swaths of interpretation. So as an ad on Google equivalent to broadcasting, in our paper we outline why we believe that could be deemed to be broadcasting, but that becomes a matter of interpretation. So we did suggest that the other approach would be to directly amend the Income Tax Act and to make it clear that foreign internet media no longer have the tax deduction. So those, we're not legislative drafters. We didn't want to go further than putting those suggestions on the table, but they're not difficult changes. They're not massive rewrites to legislation. One is as simple as simply saying that the definition of broadcasting in the Income Tax Act relates to the Broadcasting Act. The other, it would require changes to the Income Tax Act to define foreign media as no longer exempt from tax deduction.
The ultimate question then for politicians would be, well, what will be the cost to the consumer, i.e. the voter? Because it would seem to me that if there's going to be a cost to the consumer, if it's going to cost me more for my Netflix, is it going to cost me more for the internet usage that I have now? Because if it is, that's a deterrent from a political point of view. Even if there is a $1.3 billion from tax revenue that there is to be gained, the political cost may be a little more.
I would, if I could answer your question with a question, I would ask how much it costs the consumer and the taxpayer when the mayor in their town is able to spend money without scrutiny on all sorts of people and companies that are related to him or her. The function of media in many ways is to keep consumer costs down by keeping government accountable for the way that it spends money and makes decisions. The ability for the public purse to be exploited because of a lack of scrutiny, I think, is a much bigger expense to the consumer than the application of our rules for advertising.
I would agree with you. The cost of us not having an independent, aggressive news media is far greater than the political fallout that would involve some tax increases. I'm a big supporter of this. I'm also a victim of getting bad news reported in Atlantic Canada. Everything gets centralized. As I tell people, with all due respect to my friends from New Brunswick, I don't really care about about traffic problems in downtown Fredericton. You know, it's of no interest. But part of my television news is taken up by that because of the consolidation of the media. And I hear that same complaint from people across the country. I don't want to hear about the news in some part of the world. Local news that's not local is a frustration for the consumer.
May I add, Senator, because I think your question is a very important one. First of all, we're not talking about consumer taxes. So the difference between this measure and the Netflix tax is there is no direct thing that the consumer sees. That's number one. Number two, if you understand media and you understand advertisers, businesses devote a certain amount of money to advertising. They budget it. It goes to marketing. It goes to advertising. They're not going to increase their budgets. They're going to spend differently. Third, as we mentioned in the report, it's quite possible to some extent the Googles and the Facebooks will price adjust because their margins are immense. They have operating margins in Canada in the 60% range. So they could easily drop their rates if they felt that was the right competitive response. Fourthly, there are many advertising choices. The Canadian advertising pie, if you add in billboards and various other things, all of that together, the foreign component is about a third. So in terms of the Canadian advertising pie, as big as the foreign component is, it's still about a third of the whole pie. So the market would adjust. And what we as authors liked about this measure is that while you couldn't fully predict what would happen, you knew that on the one hand, either money would shift to Canadian media, and we conservatively estimated about 10% would shift to Canadian media, or it'd go into government coffers. Either way, it's a win-win. And I would submit that from a political point of view, it's a far easier thing to do because there isn't a direct consumer ramification.
My final comment, Chair, is that you need to fashion those recommendations in a way that does not make politicians nervous, and that it becomes understood that this is not going to be that this may not be a cost that's passed along to the consumer. As I pay my Netflix bill, that I don't see it reflected in that because of the government picking up on that $1.3 billion. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation this morning. I'm a Franco-Manitoban. My career was in education and community development. It is clear that to promote economic development in communities so that it is necessary for people to be able to hear themselves, to express themselves. And 2 days ago, La Liberté, which is a weekly newspaper in Manitoba that has existed for 105 years, was published on paper and also online, and it has had great difficulties. Outside Quebec, there's no doubt that organizations like Radio-Canada and local newspapers are extremely important for minority communities' development. In your report, you mention that in 2017, up to $5 billion of advertising was non-deductible, and this would amount to $1.3 billion in tax revenues for the federal government. So I would like to know where this $5 billion goes generally. Is it divided among Facebook, Google, and so on, or are there small websites that benefit from some of these advertising spending? Google and YouTube, which of course are the same entity, and Facebook take the vast majority of this spending, and other smaller websites get a small slice of this money. So the main beneficiaries of this subsidy are the major American digital companies. Thank you. I have a question that deals not directly with these proposed amendments, but the government spends money on online advertising, and I wonder what percentage of that goes to Google, YouTube, and Facebook. I'm not sure of the specific amounts that would be involved. I'll ask my colleague. The government, the federal government, apparently does tend to advertise on these major digital platforms. Should we look into the federal government's advertising online? The federal government buys a lot of advertising. One of the largest advertisers in the country is the federal government. They are not involved with this question of corporate taxes, of course, but one of the things that the government can control is where it advertises. There are responsibilities, of course, involved with the obligation to support Canadian media and journalists, and also to communicate their important messages to Canadians. So I would not call on the government to switch all of its advertising to Canadian companies, but this is something that they can influence. They could increase the amount that is directed to Canadian advertisers.
Why don't they do that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a totally good question. So as I was saying, there is a competing responsibility, obviously, between the government's desire to reach the public, and also to support Canadian media. And we don't believe that the government should use its advertising budget as a method of subsidizing the industry. So we recognize that there are competing objectives, and just as we said with corporations, we recognize that the products that are sold by Google and Facebook, for example, do provide value to advertisers. That's why we're not suggesting that these products be banned, for example, singled out, taxed punitively, or anything of that nature. And we're also not projecting that closing this loophole will end advertising with Google and Facebook. Quite the contrary. We're saying that less than 10% of that money will be repatriated as a result of the speed bump. The rest would continue to be used there. So we're not trying to question the efficacy of these products for businesses and for advertisers, including the government. We're saying that our law has long recognized a public policy objective in making sure that there is scrutiny on government, that there is Canadian storytelling that exists in small and medium markets, but also, as we're seeing in La Presse, even in some larger markets, publications are struggling to survive. And so it's about that counterbalancing objective. The economies of scale and the difference in the economies of scale between American media and Canadian media have existed for a long, long time. This isn't a new issue. The only issue is that we've failed to incorporate this new entry into the media market. This differential that we're talking about should not really exist, and part of the reason why the conversation is difficult is because we're playing catch-up with regulation that was too precisely worded and not modified over many years.
Senator Bovey.
Thank you. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for this, and I appreciate where you're coming from and the need of the work. And I'm going to build on conversation my colleague Senator Gagné started. But you mentioned in your words that the unpredictability of funding for Canada's not-for-profits. And as one who spent her career in the arts, I can tell you I lived that unpredictability for several decades, many decades. And In my experience, it's the local press, printed and otherwise, that have brought the work of our artists and our arts organizations to our local audiences to allow that engagement, which is so critically important. So you also mentioned that in the last decade we've lost 16,000 journalists. And I don't think I'm wrong, but correct me if I am, that many of our senior journalists, in fact, got their beginnings in local newspapers and in local media. That, in my research, I found that attendance in our journalism programs has gone down. So as I take a look at my concern of the quality of journalism, and I got back from the UK last night, and I have to tell you some of these arguments are there too, though the quality of journalism is certainly very high. First of all, how can we be assured that in closing this loophole, that the monies will go to strengthening journalism and encouraging young journalists to enter the field and give them the opportunity for them to grow as our generation had? And secondly, I really do appreciate that you're essentially seeking the update of the definition of broadcasting, and I agree with that. So are you sure that in the definition you're bringing forward that you're taking into account the technological changes that are going to happen in the field in the coming decades, so that it's a forward-looking definition and not just saying let's keep what was in 1991 and not keep what was in 1968? I guess I'm really concerned about going forward, and I'm really concerned about making sure that our citizens get the news. Yes, we have our own stories, and I agree that credible journalism is critical for democracy.
Can we take those in reverse order?
You can take them however you like.
Thank you. Do you want to talk about the definition and technology neutrality and things of that nature?
Yes. We recognize there are many different interests that have to be balanced. And so in the paper, we, just as a for instance, we referred to back in 1996, the government disallowed entertainment expenses.
Yes.
As deductible and changed it to 50% deductibility. And to us as authors, that was an interesting precedent of how government wanted to shift behavior. It didn't stop people from having entertainment expenses, but it did change behavior to some degree, and obviously brought money into the general tax base. So updating the definition of broadcasting is admittedly, while the simplest thing, because it's a one-word change, it's not necessarily the ideal, because among other things, as we know, the government of Canada has decided to review the Broadcasting Act and the Telecommunications Act, and we don't know where that's going to go. And so that's why we also put on the table the option of explicitly in the Income Tax Act denying tax deductibility for foreign internet services. And again, we didn't try and draft the wording to do that, but we didn't see that as a difficult thing to do. And that would be quite technologically neutral, because you're not defining what kind of service it is. You're just saying if it's a foreign-based, foreign-owned internet service, it no longer has the tax deductibility.
And on the other question of how we can be assured that that money would stay in Canada, I think the projection that we're making here is fairly conservative, and I'd like to draw a comparison between the 450 million that we are anticipating would stay in Canada as a result of this, that would be repatriated. Less than 10% of the total amount that's being spent on foreign digital advertising, right? So a very conservative estimation. And compare that to the $10 million a year that the federal government is proposing in its community journalism fund. So even if we're wrong by 50%, 70%, even if we're way off, which I don't think we are, but even if we were, we'd still be talking about much larger sums than the government is willing and able to put forward. And also we're talking about doing this in a way where the businesses can decide if they want to pay the tax or not, and many would prefer to advertise in Canada. And so the ethical pitfalls of the government choosing where this subsidy goes, I think, are avoided. So We can't be assured. We don't know what, the major American internet advertising companies will do with pricing, for example, to try and respond to this. We can't predict what the market will do. That's why it's a market-based response. But it just establishes that the existing precedent can apply to all media and not just be exempt because you happen to watch your TV on YouTube instead of, through your cable package. Why should these be treated any differently? It's the same program that you're watching on the same device. So we're just talking about parity across the law.
I'd like to pick up on Senator Bovey's question. So suppose, I'm restating your question to see if I got it right. Suppose the Toronto Star or La Liberté, any publication happened to start getting more advertising revenue. How would they, is there any assurance that they would use it to hire young journalists? No, there isn't. But we have to trust them a little bit. They're starving, they're laying people off, they're doing things because they're running out of money. And if a certain amount of new money, in this case, in the range of $400 million, sprinkled through the entire advertising ecosystem of this country a couple of years from now because of an action of the government closing this loophole, a good share of it is going to be spent on expert human journalistic labor. We'd be turning the tide.
That journalism is also one of their main moneymakers. These types of investigations, for example, and as I said previously, readership is at an all-time high. They're just not able to monetize that because often the advertising is sort of siphoned off by middlemen. So I think the desire of Canadian publications to invest in journalism is proven. There's a track record, and it's in their financial interest to do so. It's about making sure that they are able to do so by having this parity across the law.
And can I just make one concluding?
Sure.
Just a couple of words.
Pardon me. Thank you.
My concern is what is not now being covered that used to be covered. So yes, the readership is up, but I think the diversity of opinion and the diversity of subject matter covered is down, and that's what concerns me.
Yes.
Senator Galvez. As a conservative, I totally agree with you on that point. Senator Galvez.
Thank you very much. This is a very important and interesting conversation, and I think one of the sectors that have been disrupted massively by the venue of these new media outlets is journalism and the written press. I agree with some of my colleagues that some of the fault is on the press side, because good news is bad news, scandals are, and paparazzi thing sells a lot, and there is a lack of or loss of reputation that comes from the newspapers themselves. But I think that we are mixing things here, and the reason because I hear people that is for and people is against is because we are putting in the same bag advertisement and content. And advertisement meaning you put you want to sell things, products, services, whatever, and you are putting in the same level the content, which is the local content, the important content, asking accountability of the mayors and the politicians, So we are putting these two things in the same balance, in the same scale, and I think we shouldn't. So for me, it's very clear and these three propositions that you are very simple, very straightforward, and very direct, and we should support them. But I think we are not seeing how this is going to have the impact that we all want, which is to have this good content, local content, important content. Mm-hmm. And so this is one question. My other question is why the people that are producing the content cannot be paid by the content? How this content gets sold through media without being paid for the journalist that goes there and does the interview, why he's not getting paid by that? And then I'll have another question.
Sure. So I think the idea that the market is responding to content it doesn't like is one we can, kind of debate. Like I said, I think readership is very solid. News Media Canada's evidence shows that readership is very solid. On the other hand, though, part of what's good about this solution is that if Canadian businesses decided as a result of this loophole being closed that they wanted to spend more of their advertising expenditures in Canada, there'd be no one telling them who to spend it on. We're not saying you have to spend it on this newspaper or that newspaper or this website or that website, or even one that exists now. This could make room for new entrants. So the money will flow, and it could flow to new players, and we would welcome that. We have no position on which publications it should support. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there is monetization of this ad money. Google and Facebook are ad companies. As the founder of Facebook, Mr. Zuckerberg, said, somewhat demeaningly to senators in the United States, we sell ads. That's what they do. So there are people who are making money off of internet ads surrounding this exact content. It just so happens that the people who are making that money are not the people who produce the content. So there's a free rider situation happening here that we are allowing. It's a dynamic of this business model to some degree, but it's a dynamic that our Canadian tax policy is encouraging.
Senator Galvez?
Yes. On Senator Vauvenue comment about the lag that there seems to be in the speed at which our journals and newspapers are progressing. We are lagging behind. Like, I wonder why you go to China and they don't have Facebook. They have their own thing. Mm-hmm. Okay? They don't have Amazon. They have their own thing. So why we don't have our own thing? Why we don't have?
The executive director looked at me. I assume that means he wanted me to say something, and I will.
I'm just gauging your reaction.
China is the exception, not Canada. China is a totalitarian state that very much controls media. It has no public broadcaster. It has only state broadcasters right across the board. But as you will see from the coverage of the misdeeds of Facebook that have been much in the news in the last few months, it's coming up on every continent on the planet. It's an international thing. China and a few other, North Korea, I'm sure, and a few other totalitarian entities do not permit these foreign entities. We have been, for a long time, a very open country concerning the arrival of foreign media. But the statistics that are published in this book show you that an advertising is, of course, the biggest financing mechanism for media. And we have gone from something like 5% for leakage of our advertising outside the country to 35% in just 12 years. And that's the essence of the problem.
And
I understand that. I use China because I wanted to show that we are here and they are there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But you go to Europe and they are here. So
the Europeans are very well, Daniel, tell your anecdote.
Oh, I mean,
you were there.
I was. Yeah, the Europeans are definitely ahead of us in dealing with issues of data protection, but also ensuring that there is local content available on services, on video streaming services like Netflix, for example, that would approximate our existing Canadian content regulations. So they're definitely ahead of us. I think the principle that you're trying to point out is, why are we so concerned about protecting, the revenues of these companies, as opposed to trying to stand up for a Canadian alternative. And this law, Section 19, has always existed to try and create a material incentive for Canadian alternatives to proliferate and exist. For 50 years, it was quite successful in the realm of Canadian media. And we agree. And this also goes to the point of, in general, how we are looking at our tech sector. are we just trying to invite foreign multinationals to set up campuses here, or would we like to have our own tech sector that could benefit from this revenue? Right now, we are providing $1.3 billion in tax subsidies to Google, Facebook, our tech sector's biggest competitors, because we refuse to classify their ads as ads, under our law. So your question in its spirit, I think, is a very valid one. I thank you for putting it to us.
Senator Dawson.
I, for one, have no problem in trying to help you close the loophole. But I think that the big picture is much more global in the sense that there are other issues that we have to deal with. We know we're probably going to be studying, I hope, later on in the year, the bigger picture. But if there is one way we can help you. But there are distinctions that we have to make in Canada. There's a distinction between rural Canada and urban Canada. Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver have a lot of competition in the news media. And if you're mayor of Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto, trust me, they're watching you. So, and we're talking. So I think that looking at it globally, there's one big distinction there: urban, rural. And then Quebec, we produce 80% of what we consume in television. The 30 top shows in Quebec are all Quebec shows, practically. Maybe there might be an exception in English Canada, except for Big Brother Canada, which is a pale copy of Big Brother US, and CTV News and a Hockey Night in Canada, which used to be on the top and now it's nearly on the bottom. We're two different worlds. So and I don't know, Mr. Miller, I didn't find anything in the report that addresses that distinction. Yes, it's an artificial protection because of language, but it's there. So we are consuming our products because our products look like us. Nos produits canadiens, nos produits québécois, on les consomme pas.
Our Canadian and Quebec products look like us. We in Quebec watch our programming because it resembles us. It is us. We can relate to it. But if we look at the overall situation, yes, we can close loopholes, but
we're not the biggest threat. We have a bigger problem with La Presse becoming a charity case. I think they're declaring themselves non-profit, and I probably believe that they haven't been making profit for many years. They don't have to declare themselves non-profit. They weren't. They were being subsidized, obviously, by Les Desmarais. I don't want to turn around and think that the government is going to be subsidizing them unless there's a really very arm's length distance. We have it with the small newspapers in Sherbrooke, in Quebec City, in Lake Saint Jean. The Desmarais got rid of those newspapers. How much, and they're now eligible for subsidies from the Quebec government. There's a distinction there that I don't see in the proposal. But don't get me wrong, it's not because I don't agree with you closing the loophole. I think that the big picture deserves to be addressed on that issue. Everything else will come later. But I'd like to see you comment on the distinction with Quebec.
A very good question, absolutely. As you know, consumption of American media in Quebec is a lot lower than the rest of Canada. However, while we didn't look at it specifically, understanding is that Facebook and Google advertising is still a fairly significant share of the Quebec advertising marketplace. Not as high as English Canada, so it would be of benefit to French language media. But you raise a very valid point. Are there other things that need to be looked at? Absolutely. I mean, we're not suggesting, or as authors, that this is the only possible solution. We happen to think it was the one that hasn't been paid attention to, and we wanted to shine a light on it because we think, in a way, it's low-hanging fruit. But those distinctions that you speak about, the good news, as you know, is that in some respect, broadcasting in Quebec has not been as affected by the internet as much as it has in English Canada. But that's now changing. We got RNC Media, various smaller players in the Quebec marketplace that are looking at how viable their stations are. So it's a broader problem. I acknowledge that.
At our report release on April 24th, Colette Brent came in and spoke to the situation in Quebec, and I think she was saying that more than 70 media outlets in Quebec have closed their doors in recent years, and that's continuing. And I should say it's not just even English and French. I was meeting recently with a group of Pakistani media, Pakistani Urdu language media professionals in the Toronto area, and they were saying that Canadian banks, for example, are advertising through Google to reach Urdu speakers, and those ads end up on websites from Pakistan, for example, that some people are reading when they want news from home. So and there is a thriving local media sector in Urdu, but also in English about Pakistani issues. For example, 1 in 4 people in the Greater Toronto area are South Asian. So it crosses the language divide and stifles the development of new entrants into the Canadian market.
So, just briefly, I'm certainly for a Netflix tax, and I'm for closing it. But as long as the content, the profits, the money that is collected is sent to Canadian production, is said to encourage Canadian producers, because just getting more money for the government, because the people are going to be paying the tax, not Netflix. I want that money to be used to help support production.
Just to be clear, I think this is a related issue to the Netflix question in principle, but it's not the same. So closing this loophole would not affect Netflix at all. It would affect Google, Facebook, and the ad placements. The principle of making sure that our existing rules, for example, rules that apply to broadcasters also apply to internet broadcasters like Netflix, is the same principle of equal application, but specifically what we're talking about here would have no bearing on taxes paid by consumers of Netflix or Netflix itself.
Could I make a short comment to Senator Dawson? Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. One difference that we track between the French language and the English language media in this country, or we could say effectively Quebec media, is the huge concentration of ownership on the audiovisual side. And it does affect a lot of things, because there aren't that many places where you can place advertising. If CBC, for example, were to withdraw from advertising, it would create a virtual monopoly. But second comment, and I won't name him, but a senior person in Mr. Morneau's office, chatting with him a few months ago, he said, well, presumably, if we got this $700-800 million more revenue, the other 40% would be spread amongst the provinces, of course. But, presumably we'd want to keep this money to be spent for cultural reinforcement. And I thought, that's why I'm not naming him, because I think that's not the general line of the Department of Finance. But if that were to happen, if there was a fund in the Canadian government that drew from this newfound revenue to reinforce what you're talking about, that would be good public policy.
Why would that be good public policy? So now we're talking about having the deduction money that they would be raised going to a fund that the government would distribute to whom?
No. I think what Ian is referring to is that the availability of this money can allow the government to pursue any number of related objectives, not to put into a fund as a sort of pot to distribute around, but could do things like help with broadband access in small and rural communities, for example, that helps people consume the media, or supports for people who are studying
or reduce the deficit
to do placements, or reduce the deficit.
That would be a good start.
There are a number of different options.
Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to our guests. Really interesting discussion, for sure. And I'm have watched over the last decade, for sure, a somewhat disturbing at times changing media outlets across the country, and especially in my home province, Newfoundland, Labrador. And just as a note on CBC, when I grew up, we only had one channel, and that was CBC in a small rural community, and it was in many ways our window to the world. But my colleagues may not agree with me on some of that. But anyway, Saltwire Network is involved in a project in Newfoundland, Labrador now, and across Atlantic Canada, from what I understand. And for those who may not know, Saltwater Network, they own 27 Atlantic Canadian news brands, including those in Newfoundland and Labrador, and they're the largest independently owned media company in the country. And the CEO, Mark Laver, said that it's time to reconnect with the communities that we are in. So I'm hoping that their Open Up project, which is basically going out talking to people, they had a meeting last week where they had 100 people just showed up to talk about the different ways of delivering media. But the local content is the big concern. We're losing more and more and more local content. We're learning a lot about other places, not ourselves. My question has to do with the fact that what I don't understand, and maybe someone can clear it, is that the potential tax gain of $1.3 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't we want to do that, and who or where are the obstacles to making that happen?
So that's a good question. I think there are a lot of people who politically, as was mentioned earlier, might be concerned about something that looks like an increase in taxes. I know that the current government has had some challenges in its early tenure around proposals to amend the way that small businesses are treated for tax purposes. I think that's definitely one concern. The other, I think, is that 40% of that money would flow to the provinces, and we've sent letters to the premiers to this effect. So those voices are not necessarily being heard in the federal discussion, and that makes a large proportion of the revenue that's available. So it's a difficult issue. Balancing, we've often, for our entire history, we've recognized that in order for Canada to be a distinct country, that we can't just be entirely open to everything that comes from the United States. They're just so much bigger. And so we've had regulations like Section 19 that have worked and established the balance, and businesses have succeeded under these rules for many, many years. And because we've fallen behind, we now have this price differential, and we're talking about reducing it. And that, I think, makes the politics more difficult. But it doesn't mean that we should just let this disparity persist. So I'm not sure if that speaks directly to your question. I can't get inside the mind of the Minister of Finance as much as I would love to be able to get in there and whisper these recommendations. But I think some of those things are potential barriers to adoption.
And Senator, it could be a role for this committee to elicit from appropriate spokespeople for departments of the federal government the rationale for doing nothing, because it has not been articulated to us in any satisfactory manner.
There's nobody.
You should talk to Mr. Morrison, because it seems he has a pipeline right to a senior person in Morneau's office.
There's a
Times a day,
but
he hasn't told you about that until today. Go ahead, Senator Manning. Sorry.
60% of 1.3 billion is still an incredible amount of money.
752.
Exactly. So is
for the federal government.
And like in your discussions, you must hear is there opposition? Like, who do you hear the opposition from? Is there other groups like you're here making the case for this to happen? Is there somebody else making the case to government for it not to happen? That's what I'm trying to determine. Like, usually we have two sides to every story. Sometimes, in this case, we might have 10. I'm just trying to find out where's the opposition coming from, or is it just the fact of, people see it as a new tax, but at the same time, is there somebody else who's making the case for this not to happen that you're aware of?
Senator, I can make two observations on that. While this is tax policy, it's viewed as through the prism of cultural policy. So it's one of those files that doesn't have, in a sense, a single home, because while finance and CRA are responsible for the administration, typically it would be Canadian Heritage that might have carriage of the file because it's cultural policy. And we happen to think that from a policy development point of view, it simply fell through the cracks. For whatever reason, we are aware of no examination of this issue from the federal government. In terms of opposition, the opposition, first and foremost, will come from the Googles and the Facebooks. Absolutely. They will oppose. I'm sure they have already. Secondly, it would be advertisers either through business groups like the Business Council of National Issues, I don't know, or advertiser groups will oppose because they'll see it as a loss of a deduction for advertisers.
I would also note that that opposition has political implications. The House Ethics Committee recently, was trying to interrogate relationships, for example, between Google, Facebook, and the government, and whether or not regulation is impeded as a result of expediency of personal relationships and things like that. So Google is the #1 lobbyist in the United States. Last year, more than the pharmaceutical companies, more than the defense companies, more than the large agribusiness companies. By dollar amount, the #1 lobbyist. So there's a lot of politics involved here, and that I don't think that should go forgotten in this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. Chair.
The growth of digital advertising over the past 25 years has not been confined to only Canada. This is a universal phenomenon. And I'm just curious, I'm trying to keep an open mind to this. Other countries are facing this, I would assume other countries are facing the same set of circumstances. Have other countries, if there are other countries, I'd like you to name them and show me who they are, explain it to us. But have other countries taken measures to reduce the percentage of internet advertising being eligible for tax deductions? And what was the result?
I can say honestly that I'm not aware of any other countries that have done this, but Canada, as you know, was always quite unique in our proactiveness in terms of shoring up and supporting a domestic content and media industry. And so the reason, again, we were attracted to this is not the international precedent, but the Canadian precedent. That it's a logical extension of what we did in the 50s and 60s.
And to reinforce Peter's point, we're not talking about a new provision, right? We're talking about applying a provision that's been on the books for years and years and years and just treating it equally. So that's the first thing. But there are other countries that are taking measures to get rid of the sort of free ridership that allows some of these media companies to boost their profits. Germany, for example, is holding Facebook responsible, actually all social media networks with more than 2 million users in the country, responsible for obvious hate speech, for example, that is published on their platforms, and not letting them say, oh, we have nothing to do with that, that wasn't our choice. There are other regulations in data protection, for example, that are now requiring these companies to tell you why they showed you this thing, to basically explain some of their roles as an editor and a curator so that they can be held responsible for some of those decisions. So there are other ways in which our peers in the developed world are recognizing that these companies are not as different as they might claim to be, that they act as publishers in the same way that other publishers have acted, and they are bringing them into the regulatory system in that way. So in that sense, Canada is actually quite behind the curve. Australia, New Zealand, all of these countries are trying to create some parity between these different forms of media, and in that sense, we would be no different.
Senator, just to go back to your root question, we are aware of no other countries that have an equivalent to Section 19 in their form of what we call the Income Tax Act. In other words, it was developed out of unique Canadian proximity to the American market and the dumping of journalistic content into the Canadian market 5-6 decades ago. So, but that might be something through your connection with the Library of Parliament that you could investigate a multi-country approach to this issue.
One more question.
Yeah.
I believe the reason advertising is down in Canadian publications and up online is because people who want to market their products choose to do it digitally because they're trying to increase their market share. If we would take away their tax deduction, their tax avoidance, wouldn't it just make it more expensive for Canadians to advertise and for Canadian companies to compete?
So It's a very good question. The answer, I think, is difficult to predict. Like I said earlier, it's impossible to know whether, Google, Facebook, some of these other large foreign advertising companies would reduce prices, for example, to adjust for this. As Peter said, their margins in Canada are estimated to be north of 60%, so there's definitely room to be able to do that. And the businesses would continue to advertise, and they could continue to advertise digitally as well, but with Canadian publications if they'd like to take advantage of the full deduction. I'm sure all of you read newspapers from your home province and city and region. You were here this morning, you probably didn't get it delivered in hard copy, you read it digitally, and that would be great. And advertising placed with those publications in a digital form would continue to be deductible and would therefore be more beneficial, relatively speaking, for Canadian businesses to pursue. So there's this artificial price differential which is created by the failure to apply this existing law to this new technology. We're talking about eliminating that differential by catching up and making digital advertising with Canadian publications more advantageous and beneficial for reaching the Canadian public who, like you and like me, are already reading these things online in a digital format. It's just that they're not able to get paid for it because of the way that the middleman is treated.
So just so you could maybe enlighten me a little on, Google's a search engine, so it has access to obviously, people use Google to access NBC, CBS, Fox, New York Times, National Post.
Mm-hmm.
So where does Google get its news? Does it not get it from other news media organization?
You mean where does it get the content?
Where does it get its content? Its own content, which they call Google News, or what are they?
Oh, it's like the Google News feed, for
right.
example.
So where does it get its content?
That content is taken from journalistic organizations like the Globe and Mail.
Don't they have to pay for it?
No.
So the Globe and Mail lets them take their stuff, their copyrighted material, and broadcast it and charge advertising for it?
Well, there's free content that is available all over the internet, and newspapers historically were, basically free. I mean, what you used to pay in subscription or for a single issue, barely covered the cost of distribution, right? The advertising revenue was by far the largest share. So a free content model supported by advertising has existed for a long, long time. As you've said, there are now kind of key gatekeepers or intermediaries who are facilitating access to this content, and they are able now to take the lion's share of the advertising revenue because they are the focal or the entry point, without providing any of the public value of creating that content on its own. So previously, when you would pick up a copy of the, Toronto Star or, La Presse or whatever newspaper you're reading, you wouldn't really be paying for it. The revenue for the publisher would not really come from what you paid. It would be because you were viewing. Facebook and Google work the exact same way, except those publishers actually paid for the journalism that you were reading, and the money went back to them directly. Now there's this middleman who doesn't have to pay for anything, who gets all of the benefit because they happen to be the aggregator. So if you're interested in a company that provides the value in the marketplace, being compensated for that value, which is typically how the principle of supply and demand works, I think we should be alarmed by the fact that there is this free rider tier who does provide some value and should be compensated for it, but is likely getting a much, much larger size of the pie on the back of work that other people have produced. I think that's what we're talking about.
Facebook is the same, right?
Yes.
They get free content, and then they resell advertising for that free content, which seems to me almost illegal. But I mean, shouldn't the publications be taking legal action to protect their content?
I mean, Peter may have something to add.
If I'm Rex Murphy and I'm writing a column, and Facebook's selling that column to get advertising, isn't that an infringement of copyright? Isn't that a problem, a civil problem of some kind?
Senator, as you know, copyright is
just
a
trying
creature.
To understand this.
No, it's a very good question. Copyright is a creature of statute, and the way we've structured copyright laws is, so for example, if you put a song out there and someone plays or reproduces that song, there is a copyright royalty
that
goes back to the record labels and and the artist. But we haven't done that in print. It's just the way we've designed it. So there is, once you have a right to a paywall, and if you put a paywall around it, you can prevent someone from accessing it. And as you know, the Globe and Mail now, there's some stories that are free online and some you have to be a subscriber. So you can do that. But once you've let it free, you have no further ability to get compensation. And technically that's because the search engine ads are not in the content. They are, they're allowing people to get to it. Now you may have heard.
Well, it's just like a radio station, though. They have music, and they play music, and the artists and the record companies say, you got to pay us.
Well,
Otherwise, you can't play that music.
The power relationship between the Tragically Hip or Arcade Fire and one community radio station is much more balanced than the relationship between Le Devoir or a paper from Lloydminster and Facebook. So, the local radio station can't survive without the #1 hits of the day because that's their audience. Facebook would probably be fine without a local newspaper, the Star Phoenix, for example, from Saskatoon. So the power differential is huge, and these guys are effectively a monopoly, which is very, very different to the dynamic of companies interacting with a commercial radio station, to use your example. And our policy is just encouraging that monopoly to proliferate because we have these existing rules that are meant to try and compensate for these differences of economies of scale that are not being applied in this circumstance where the difference of the economy of scale is way bigger. I think your point is exactly the point, is that the companies themselves are not in a position to be able to stand up and make claims. The market on its own is so unbalanced in favor of one or two basically monopoly players that the individual content providers, especially small content providers like a Star Phoenix, are not able to do it. And that's why we're talking about a structural solution that doesn't say stop advertising on Facebook. It just says let those ads be treated like all other ads because we've recognized that this advances public policy objectives, such as having a Star Phoenix being around. It just changes the dynamic a little bit so that an advertiser in Saskatoon can say, if I want to reach my audience, maybe I should put it in the Star Phoenix instead of in a Google ad, which will appear, who knows where, because actually the price is now a lot closer, and I can have the same effect. So that's what we're talking about, is leveling that playing field, because right now the bargaining power just doesn't exist.
Senator,
I'd like to explore that.
You used the criminal metaphor just a while ago. Another metaphor might be the medical or the biological metaphor of the parasite.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it is.
That's what it is, I think, because here you have all these writers who are creating news and publishing it in newspapers where they get their salary from, and other people are taking that news and obviously using it as an incentive for people to turn on to use Facebook so they can sell ads, which seems to me, I think it's terrible policy. So maybe we can explore that a little further. Thank you very much, Senators. This has been it's been a good meeting. I think we're going to follow up tomorrow. Tomorrow we're just going to meet a little bit to finalize our sort of future witnesses on this matter, and so it won't be a long meeting. I'm sure you're all happy about that, and this has been a very interesting discussion, and I'm going to look forward to where it's going to end up. Adjourned.